Hello, welcome to the podcast. Let me start here. I think Trump's going to win, and this is why. But before I start, let me appease Americans in advance. I'm a Brit, so I have no horse in the race. I just wanted to explain my perception of the US election from an outsider's perspective, and I'm currently in Fort Lauderdale, as you might be able to tell. So I thought being in America on election day is actually pretty cool because I really like politics. The podcast is probably going to have quite a lot of politics in it, but I don't want it to be entirely about politics. But I thought this is a good place to start. It just made sense for me. So I've made notes because I decided to do this video last night. So forgive me for reading from my makeshift teleprompter, my iPhone. This won't be my typical studio, but I wanted to get something out before the result tomorrow. So I just wanted to get it done. So here we go. Now, before I start, I reiterate, I am British. So I have vast gaps in my knowledge of American politics and the views of Americans. I also have a parliamentary system with a prime minister, not a presidential system with a president. Also, I've only ever been to America twice in my adult life, this being one of them. So my understanding of American political culture is limited. I have, however, read parts of the US Constitution, and I understand some powers of the president. There we go, there's some caveats. All that being said, I think Americans, because it seems to be really divided out here, would benefit from remembering they have fairly strong checks and balances in their country with kind of a tripartition of power with the legislative, the executive and the judicial branch. And they all curtail the power of one another, which is something that can't always be said in the UK. So just remember, your political system does have some good bits, okay? Okay, it's good to walk. Crossroads confuse me in your country though, I will be honest. Okay, I'm gonna run because there's a Corvette there and he might want to go after I walk. So, yeah, look, America, but then there's a range. Big up the Brits. Aside, I've seen more Rolls-Royce Cullinans in Miami than I have ever in the UK, and they all curtail the power of one another. For example, the president can veto laws passed by Congress, but then Congress can veto the veto if they get a 2/3 majority vote in Congress. So the president, in my understanding, isn't this kind of unchallengeable overlord that can just do what they want. I feel like in America, because of the presidential system, people kind of think that, you know, they become this kind of fascist leader, and I don't think that's the case. But I should say I'm not here to compare political systems. In the UK, for example, we have a wholly unelected second chamber. Our second chamber, which is part of our lawmaking apparatus, is completely unelected. We don't vote for them and they make our laws. Pretty crazy if you ask me, but they do a good job. So, you know, pros and cons. That's another video. But yeah, just wanted to point out that I'm not suggesting because I'm a Brit commenting on your political system that our system is better, it's just different. But back to the point I was making, from an outsider looking in, if I look at the US or France, I see a presidential system, and I think sometimes presidential systems focus too much on a single person and therefore a single issue, and as a result, elections can be really divisive. I'm not saying other systems are less divisive, but you could definitely make a strong argument that that is the case. I'm a huge believer in policy over personality. Too often we focus on the personality of the leader as opposed to their actual policies, and that is crystal clear in America, but I kind of feel there's quite a entrenched celebrity culture in America, so that might be the reasons as to why. But purely based on my engagement with the internet in all its forms and kind of traditional media outlets, I feel that the view of Trump in the public is not as negative as the traditional media would have you believe. And I think that's dangerous if you are a Democrat. Again, I'm not a Republican. I'm a Republican in the sense that I would rather not have a monarchy, but I'm not a Republican in terms of the American Party. But I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. However, I think the Democrats might have made a mistake by going down the lines of negative campaigning. Trump's a racist, Trump's a misogynist, Trump's a bully. I don't think that's the perception of most Americans. Could be wrong. This is a prediction. I could well be wrong. But all they have to do is convince 50% of the populace that he is, and I don't know if they're going to be able to achieve that. My perception is the view of Trump is not as negative as traditional media would have you believe. Additionally, my perception is the last election, like a lot of elections in the last 5-10 years, appear to be centred around working class people pushing back against the so-called establishment. That's what we saw with Brexit, that's what we saw with Corbyn, with Boris, with Trump in 2016. It's people saying, I don't like the status quo, and I would like something different, please. And I think as long as the Democrats, if you are a Democrat, if you fail to recognise that this seems to be centred around an anti-establishment sentiment, you're not going to feel the right candidate. I saw a news report the other day that said a group of Fortune 500 company heads have put their vote behind Harris. Now, I think that will have the opposite effect of what they want. I think if the powers that be, the people that control the money in the businesses, put their vote behind one candidate, all of them do that, then that candidate effectively represents that group, the so-called establishment. And so when Fortune 500 company heads put their vote behind Harris, I think that has the opposite effect. I think that will push ordinary Americans towards Trump. I just do. Similarly, Dick Cheney. I don't think history will look on Dick Cheney positively. I think he's in that group of unfortunate politicians who made a bad foreign policy decision that cost the lives of millions, a bit like Tony Blair. Tony Blair in our country, often his policies and achievements get ignored, because of Iraq, simply. No one can detach Tony Blair from Iraq, and so everything else New Labour achieved in the 13 years they were in power gets undermined and gets ignored. And I think Dick Cheney is part of that kind of hawkish war cabinet, and as a result, when Dick Cheney, a lifelong Republican, goes, I'm voting for Harris, that's just reiterating the fact that the establishment are behind Harris and push ordinary Americans towards Trump. Furthermore, and very simply speaking, looking at the optics of this election, very simply, kind of the fundamentals of this election, you have in 2016, you have a so-called, oh my God, there's big ass lizards there. What the fuck? I didn't know Fort Lauderdale had lizards like that. They look like bloody iguanas. It might have been an iguana. That's cool. Anyway. Now, just to go back to the optics of this election, specifically comparing it to the 2016 election, you have an establishment candidate from the Democrats, someone who's been in politics a very long time, and also female. Now, I say that only to draw comparison to now, not for any other reason, just to say, look at the realities of the two candidates and see if that's a good choice when going against the candidate you already lost to. 2016, Hillary Clinton. Been in politics a long time, part of the establishment, also female. Against Donald Trump, brash, non-politician-like businessman who is quite hard to debate because he is ruthless in debates and goes off topic and goes personal. Okay, so you field Hillary Clinton, for better or worse, she loses. Okay, 8 years, roll forward, 8 years, you have Trump again. Who do we field? I know what we should do. We should go for an establishment lady, okay? I'm not saying in a progressive society like America, gender particularly plays a part in whether someone can be elected or not. But if it does, you have to recognise we might see a similar trend to 2016 where Harris loses as a result of that. I'm not saying it does, I'm just saying if it does, why have they fielded the same candidate? Also, Harris did not go through a primary. I'm not sure if I'm getting the word right there, but she got inserted by the Democrats. They didn't go through kind of a primary party election. That's what we call it in the UK. She didn't go through that. Even Barack Obama raised issue with that at the time, saying, I don't think it's wise that we're just inserting someone. Nevertheless, she got support and she is the candidate. I think that again could look like the establishment inserting a candidate that isn't going to upset the apple cart. Now, I'm saying this is the perception. That's not what I think, but it's the perception of Americans from what I see as part of internet culture. Again, the algorithms could be sending me wild, who knows, but that's my perception. My shoulder is aching, bloody hell. Now, the most important part of the whole election so far, Joe Rogan. Now, I've watched the podcast with Trump and honestly, I wasn't impressed. Generally speaking, just not impressed. Some interesting insights into the life of a president, but nothing groundbreaking in terms of policy. Nothing that I thought, yes, that's going to markedly improve the lives of millions of Americans. And again, I refer you to the first paragraph where I say I have gaps in my knowledge. I could be wrong. But I like politicians who actually have a well thought out policy that would help alleviate problems and build a better future, and also politicians that can articulate that vision clearly. Now, I don't think Harris or Trump can do that, and I'm not saying we have better politicians in the UK, although there are some good politicians in the UK. Undoubtedly, there are some good ones in America as well. But Jesus, the levels of candidates in this presidential election seem subpar. And I'll say that kindly. Now, I'm not saying I want politicians necessarily to have a really finessed, well-executed speech that sounds like a politician. I think Trump benefits from the fact that he isn't very clear-cut and concise. People kind of see him as more personable, more like a human than a robot. But being able to articulate a vision, that's what I want to get behind. I'm just going to add this bit in because I think I missed it when I was walking. I forgot to read out my notes. I just wanted to say that I think that even if you agree with me that Trump on Joe Rogan wasn't that impressive, I think the very fact that he did it compared to Harris not doing it and Trump doing flagrant actually works in his favour, because I feel like there's an increasingly large movement of people who want long form conversations with politicians as opposed to kind of sound bites. So I think, irrelevant of whether you were impressed with him or not, it kind of does much to humanise Trump, and Harris just remains this kind of far out figure who didn't do a podcast, if that makes sense. I know she's done a few YouTube bits. I've not seen all of them, if I'm being completely honest. But having said that, in the UK, Labour kind of didn't really make any bold election promises. Kind of stayed out of the way. Kind of stayed out of the way of the Tories destroying themselves in the UK. So it could pay off, but I think it was probably a bad move for her to not do any of that. One more thing. As much as Joe Rogan tried to push him on policy, Joe Rogan isn't a journalist, and it's quite obvious when he interviews a lot of podcasters, if I'm honest, when they interview politicians, I don't think they push hard enough, or maybe they don't have a deep enough understanding of policy to push hard enough. I'm not saying I do, just an observation that sometimes politicians kind of run rings around podcasters, and Joe Rogan is not immune to that. On a side note, I hate negative campaigning, and America is obsessed with it, and so is the UK to a large extent, where we focus heavily on how bad the other person would be and how terrible their policies are, as opposed to how good I would be and how good my policies are. I think that would be a good barometer for where we are politically, when you have a candidate who goes, I don't care what the other person is doing, this is what we're going to do. And if you set that out clearly, I think, well, as I say, I think it'd be a good barometer to where we are in terms of... Thanks, man. I think it'd be a good barometer for, well, fielding better candidates, frankly, which would be, a nice change from the last 14 years for us, really. Okay, my shoulder is aching. To just reiterate that point, I don't really know what a Trump presidency looks like. I know what it doesn't look like. Equally, I don't really know what a Harris presidency looks like, other than dissimilar to Trump. So, we've got work to do. We've got work to do in our democracies, I would say. Okay, now I want to comment on the Tony Hinchcliffe joke, because that seemed to be kind of big news, or it made big headlines in the UK. Racist joke, okay? Now, there seems to be two camps when you're talking about this. Either that Puerto Rican joke was racist and awful, and Tony Hinchcliffe is a terrible man, or you're in camp two, kind of like JD Vance. Oh, everyone's so offended all the time. If everyone would just a bit more common sense, blah-de-blah-de-blah. I propose a third camp. How's this for a third camp? Not offended, but also didn't find it funny. It didn't cause me to laugh. It's just simply an unfunny joke. How's that? I just think it's terrible comedy and cheap humour, and speaks to the fact that neither candidate is very good. How's that? I'm not offended. I didn't find it funny. Full stop. Period. Done. I just feel like everything's so divided in terms of whether you found something funny or offensive. How about a third camp? It was just a shit joke. And I'm not a hater on Tony Hinchcliffe. I actually kind of watch a bit of Kill Tony. He's all right. Yeah, he's sometimes funny. That was not a funny joke. He would even admit himself that that is not a well thought out joke. So for it to become such big news, and don't get me wrong, if I was Puerto Rican, I would probably feel different about it or have stronger views about it. But as I say, not offended, just didn't find it funny. Now, this is the end of my first podcast, but some final thoughts. Elon's lottery for people who vote Trump is wild. Wild. Whatever side of the political spectrum you are on, you should agree that is problematic. When you have the wealth inequality you have in America and the richest person in America saying, you know, if you vote one way, there's an offer of a prize. I've just read that a judge in Pennsylvania said it can kind of go on for now. But if you don't think that's problematic, I think you're probably on the side of undermining true democracy. if I'm honest. And that doesn't, you don't have to be left or right to think that. Surely that's problematic. Whether it's legal or not remains to be seen, but I think that's a slippery slope if you continue to allow that to happen. Anyways, that's the end of my first podcast. Love you lots, America. I actually fully rate America. I've been here twice in my adult life, twice in the last year, as it happens. And yeah, you know how to country, you really do. Some place. I feel great when I'm here, it's just got a good vibe to it. You know, I feel like a lot of people feel that when they're in other countries, but yeah, I just like America. I like talking to people. I like how kind of massive it is for me. For me, sometimes England can feel very small. So yeah, I like the size. Although I was slightly disappointed the other day. I went to a Heat game and they got spanked by the Knicks. And obviously I was part of the home crowd, so I was a bit like, oh man, that's a bit sad. Yeah, Karl Anthony Towns doing bits. Tyler Hero played well, but yeah, they got spanked, to be honest. They never looked like they were going to win, really. Also, that Dwayne Wade statue is jokes. That is so funny. There was just kind of a widespread consensus that it was a terrible statue. And yeah, someone yelled, "That's a great statue of Lawrence Fishburne," and everyone was just creasing. So yeah, that was good. But yeah, that's it for me. Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, has just announced the budget, so I will see how that's gone down in the UK. Might do a video on that. Not really sure where this podcast is going to go, but I wanted to start it here in Fort Lauderdale. And yeah, I'll worry about my country. You worry about yours. I hope it all goes well. And yeah, peace and love. See you soon. Peace.